The words hit me like a physical blow. Mum, honestly, you should just be grateful we invite you at all. My daughter Rebecca's voice carried that familiar edge of irritation, the one I'd been hearing more and more over the past few years. I stood there in her pristine kitchen, holding the casserole dish I'd brought for Sunday dinner, feeling like I'd been slapped. The silence stretched between us as her words echoed in my mind. Grateful. As if my presence at my own family's dinner table was some kind of charity case. I'd been coming to these Sunday dinners for 3 years now, ever since my husband Harold passed away. At first, Rebecca had insisted. Mum, you can't just sit alone in that house every weekend, she'd said. Come have dinner with us. The kids need to see their grandmother more. Back then, it felt like genuine concern, like she actually wanted me there. But somewhere along the way, something had shifted, and I'd been too hopeful, too desperate to maintain our connection, to acknowledge what was happening right in front of me. The conversation that led to her cutting remark had started innocuously enough. I'd mentioned that my neighbour, Dorothy, was having a garage sale next weekend, and asked if Rebecca and the kids might want to come look through some items. There are some beautiful vintage pieces, I'd said, trying to inject enthusiasm into my voice. And you know how little Sophie loves old jewellery boxes. But Rebecca had rolled her eyes in that way that made me feel like I was being ridiculous. Mum, we don't need more junk cluttering up the house. And honestly, we've already got plans next weekend anyway. That's when I'd made my mistake. I'd pushed just a little. What kind of plans? Maybe I could join you. It was a simple question, born from loneliness and a desire to spend more time with my grandchildren. But the look that crossed Rebecca's face told me I'd overstepped some invisible boundary I hadn't even known existed. Her husband, James, had glanced up from his phone, and I caught the quick exchange of looks between them, the kind married couples share when they're communicating without words. Mum, Rebecca had said, her voice taking on that patient tone people use with children or the elderly. We're going to the Hendersons' barbecue. It's a couples thing, adults only. The emphasis on couples wasn't lost on me. I wasn't part of a couple anymore. I was just a single, aging woman who apparently didn't fit into their social circles. But I'd persisted, suggesting I could help with the kids while they went out, or maybe we could do something together on Sunday instead. That's when she'd delivered the blow about being grateful. The worst part was how matter-of-fact she'd sounded, as if she was simply stating an obvious truth. Not angry, not emotional, just tired of me, tired of accommodating me, tired of pretending that I was truly welcome in her carefully curated life. I looked around her kitchen with its granite countertops and stainless steel appliances, everything perfectly organized and spotless, and suddenly felt like an intruder. The casserole dish in my hands, Harold's mother's recipe that Rebecca used to love, now felt heavy and unwanted. I see, I'd managed to say, though my voice came out smaller than I'd intended. Rebecca had already turned back to her meal prep, dismissing the entire conversation as if my feelings didn't matter at all. James had retreated further into his phone, probably checking sports scores or work emails, anything to avoid the awkwardness that now filled the room. From the living room, I could hear my grandchildren, 8-year-old Sophie and 10-year-old Brandon, playing video games, completely oblivious to the fact that their grandmother was being systematically pushed out of their lives. I'd set the casserole dish on the counter and excused myself to use the bathroom. But really, I just needed a moment to collect myself. Standing in Rebecca's powder room, with its expensive wallpaper and monogrammed hand towels, I caught sight of myself in the mirror. At 63, I looked older than my years, worn down by grief, and now this growing realization that my own daughter saw me as a burden. My grey hair needed a touch-up, and the cardigan I'd chosen looked shabby compared to Rebecca's designer casual wear. But it wasn't just about appearances or social status. It was about the fundamental shift in how she saw me. I wasn't her mother anymore. Not really. I was an obligation, a duty to be managed and scheduled around, like taking the car in for maintenance or dealing with the insurance company. When had I become such an inconvenience? When had my presence at family gatherings transformed from welcomed to tolerated to barely endured? Walking back to the kitchen, I'd tried to shake off the hurt and participate in the remainder of the evening as normally as possible. We'd eaten dinner, and I'd attempted to engage the children in conversation about school and their activities. But I noticed how Rebecca kept checking the time, how she'd steer conversations away from topics that might invite my input, how she'd grown impatient when I'd lingered too long over dessert. Every small interaction felt loaded with her unspoken message. This is temporary. Don't get too comfortable. Don't overstay your welcome. The drive home that night gave me time to think, and the more I reflected on the evening, the more I began to see patterns I'd been blind to before. It wasn't just that one comment about being grateful. It was the accumulation of dozens of small slights and dismissals over recent months. The way Rebecca would schedule family activities without mentioning them to me until after the fact. How she'd grown increasingly critical of everything from my driving to my cooking to my opinions on current events. The subtle but unmistakable way she'd started treating me like I was losing my mental faculties, even though at 63 I was still sharp as a tack. I thought back to Harold's funeral 3 years ago. Rebecca had been wonderful then, organizing everything, taking care of details I couldn't handle in my grief. She'd moved me through those terrible first weeks with efficiency and compassion, and I'd been so grateful for her strength when I had none left. But somewhere in the transition from acute grief to the long process of rebuilding my life as a widow, her attitude had changed. The compassionate daughter had been replaced by someone who saw my continued need for family connection as clingy and pathetic. It had started small, comments about how I should get out more and make new friends. Suggestions that I join senior center activities or volunteer somewhere, always delivered with the implication that I was becoming too dependent on family for social interaction. When I'd tried to explain that those activities felt foreign to me, that I'd rather spend time with people I loved, she'd grown impatient. "Mum, you can't expect us to be your entire social life," she'd said more than once, as if wanting to see my only child and grandchildren regularly was somehow unreasonable. Then there were the changes in how our visits were structured. What had once been spontaneous and relaxed became scheduled and time-limited. "Can you be here by 5?" she'd ask. "We need to get the kids to bed by 8. Or, let's keep it short today. James has an early meeting tomorrow." Every interaction began to feel like it came with a clock attached, as if my presence was being rationed out in carefully measured doses. The most painful part was watching how she interacted with James's mother, Karen. Karen lived in Florida and visited twice a year, and those visits were celebrations. Rebecca would take time off work, plan special outings, cook elaborate meals. Karen's opinions were solicited and valued. Her stories were listened to with genuine interest. When Karen spoke, people leaned in. When I spoke, I often felt like I was interrupting something more important, even if it was just silence. I'd tried to talk to Rebecca about this disparity once, carefully suggesting that maybe I could be included in some of the special activities they planned for Karen's visits. "That's different, Mom," she'd said. "Karen only visits twice a year. You're here all the time." The casual cruelty of that statement had stunned me, as if being geographically close to my family was a disadvantage rather than a blessing, as if my regular presence in their lives had somehow devalued me in her eyes. The Sunday dinners themselves had become increasingly uncomfortable over the months. I'd arrive with a contribution, a dessert, a side dish, flowers from my garden. only to find that Rebecca had already prepared everything she wanted for the meal. My offerings would be accepted with polite thanks, but often went largely untouched. I'd sit at their dining room table making conversation while feeling like a guest who'd overstayed her welcome, watching the clock and trying to gauge the exact moment when I should excuse myself to avoid that look of impatience crossing Rebecca's face. Even my relationship with my grandchildren had been subtly managed and limited. I'd offer to babysit so Rebecca and James could have date nights, but there was always a reason why it wouldn't work. I'd suggest special grandmother-grandchildren outings, but Rebecca would find reasons to postpone or cancel them. When I did spend time with Sophie and Brandon, it felt supervised, as if Rebecca was worried about what I might say or do in her absence. The isolation had been creeping up on me gradually. My social circle had shrunk significantly after Harold's death. Couple friends had drifted away, as they often do when one half of a partnership dies. My own siblings lived across the country, and at our age, visits were infrequent. I'd tried joining some community activities, but at 63, I was often one of the younger participants in senior programs, while being too old to fit comfortably into general adult social groups. Rebecca's family had become my primary source of connection, which made her growing resentment of my presence all the more devastating. Looking back, I could see that I'd been accommodating these changes, adapting my behavior to try to make myself more welcome, more convenient, less burdensome. I'd shortened my visits, brought smaller contributions, spoke less, asked for less. I'd been shrinking myself to fit into whatever space Rebecca was willing to give me, and it still wasn't enough. The woman who had once been Harold's partner, who had raised Rebecca and supported her through college and early marriage, had been reduced to someone who should be grateful for basic family inclusion. That night, lying in the bed I'd shared with Harold for 38 years, I made a decision that would change everything. If Rebecca truly saw my presence as such a burden, if she genuinely believed I should be grateful for whatever scraps of attention she was willing to throw my way, then I would stop accepting them altogether. I would stop participating in this charade where I pretended to be welcome while she pretended to want me there. I would call her bluff and see exactly how much she actually valued having me in her life. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. The hurt from Rebecca's words was still there, but it was accompanied by something else: determination. I spent the morning going through my routine: coffee, morning news, a walk around the neighborhood, but everything felt different. I was seeing my life through new eyes, evaluating what I'd been accepting and why I'd been accepting it. The woman staring back at me from the bathroom mirror looked tired and diminished, but there was a spark of something that had been missing for too long: self-respect. I decided to start small. Rebecca called me Tuesday afternoon, as she usually did midweek, with a brief rundown of family logistics. "Sunday dinner is at 5:30 this week," she said, her tone matter-of-fact. "James has a conference call at 8, so we'll need to keep it short." This was exactly the kind of conversation that had been chipping away at my sense of worth. Being informed rather than invited, having time limits imposed, being treated like a scheduling item rather than a family member. "Actually, I won't be able to make it this Sunday," I heard myself say. The words came out more confidently than I'd expected, and there was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. Rebecca had grown so accustomed to my automatic acceptance of whatever terms she set that my declining seemed to genuinely surprise her. "What? Why not? Do you have other plans?" Her tone carried a hint of suspicion, as if the idea of me having anything else to do was somehow suspect. For a moment, I considered making up an elaborate excuse, creating some fictional commitment that would seem important enough to justify my absence. But then I remembered her words from Sunday. "You should just be grateful we invite you at all." "I'm just not available," I said simply. But I hope you all have a lovely dinner. I kept my voice pleasant, but didn't offer any additional explanation. The silence stretched between us, and I could almost hear Rebecca trying to process this unexpected development. She'd grown so used to me accommodating her schedule, her preferences, her limitations on our relationship, that the possibility of me setting my own boundaries seemed to have caught her completely off guard. "Well," she said finally, and I could hear the irritation creeping into her voice. "I guess we'll see you next week then." She hung up without her usual goodbye, and I realized that even her phone manner with me had become perfunctory over the months. When had we stopped having real conversations? When had our interactions been reduced to logistical exchanges and duty calls? That Sunday, I woke up without the familiar anxiety that had been accompanying these family dinners. No worrying about what to bring, no calculating the exact right time to leave, no bracing myself for subtle criticisms or dismissive comments. Instead, I made myself a nice breakfast, read the entire newspaper without hurrying, and decided to visit the botanical gardens I'd been wanting to see for months, but had never made time for. The gardens were beautiful, full of families and couples enjoying the late spring weather. I found myself talking to other visitors, sharing observations about different plants and flowers. An elderly gentleman named Frank struck up a conversation about roses, and we ended up walking through several sections together, comparing notes on gardening techniques. It struck me that this random stranger had shown more genuine interest in my thoughts and experiences in 2 hours than my own daughter had in recent memory. Monday morning brought another call from Rebecca, and this time her tone was different. "Mum, is everything okay? You seemed off on the phone last week." There was something in her voice I hadn't heard in a long time, actual concern. Not the impatient tolerance that had become her default mode with me, but genuine worry that something might be wrong. "I'm fine," I assured her. "Just making some changes in how I spend my time." I didn't elaborate, and the silence that followed was telling. Rebecca was clearly waiting for me to expand, to explain myself, to reassure her that everything would go back to normal. But I'd realized that normal had been slowly destroying my sense of self-worth, and I wasn't interested in returning to it. "What kind of changes?" she asked, and I could hear that edge of control in her voice, the one she'd been using more and more when discussing my activities and decisions. It was the tone she probably used with her children when she suspected they weren't telling her the whole truth about something. "Just exploring some new interests," I said. "Speaking of which, I won't be available for dinner this Sunday either." This time, the silence was longer and heavier. I could practically feel Rebecca's frustration building through the phone line. She'd obviously expected that missing one dinner would be enough to make me realize how much I needed these family gatherings, and my continued unavailability was clearly not part of her script. "Mum, what's going on? Are you upset about something?" Her voice had taken on that patronizing tone again, the one that suggested I was being unreasonable or overly emotional. It was the same tone she used when the children were throwing tantrums, and hearing it directed at me crystallized something important. Rebecca had stopped seeing me as her equal, as an adult woman deserving of respect and consideration. Somewhere along the way, I'd been demoted to dependent status in her mind. "I'm not upset," I said calmly. "I'm just choosing to spend my Sundays differently for a while." The word choosing was deliberate. For too long, I'd been allowing Rebecca to make choices about my involvement in family activities, accepting whatever level of inclusion she was willing to offer. Now I was asserting my own agency, my own right to decide how to spend my time and energy. The conversation ended awkwardly, with Rebecca clearly wanting to push for more information, but not quite knowing how to do it without sounding controlling or unreasonable. After I hung up, I realized that for the first time in months, I felt energized rather than drained after talking to my daughter. There was something liberating about not automatically accommodating her preferences, not immediately adjusting my schedule to fit her convenience. By the third Sunday, Rebecca's calls had become more frequent and increasingly pointed. She'd started reaching out with what she claimed were casual check-ins, but each conversation included pointed questions about my weekend plans and subtle attempts to gauge my availability for family activities. When I mentioned that I'd been to a lecture at the community college on Tuesday evening, she'd responded with surprise that bordered on suspicion. "Since when are you interested in art history?" she'd asked, as if my developing new interests was somehow suspicious or uncharacteristic. The truth was, I'd been discovering parts of myself that had been dormant for years. Without the anxiety and disappointment that had come to surround my family visits, I had mental and emotional energy to invest in other pursuits. I'd signed up for a watercolor class, started volunteering at the library's literacy program, and begun attending a weekly book club that met at the local coffee shop. Each new activity brought me into contact with people who saw me as I was now, not filtered through decades of family history and assumptions about who I should be. The book club, in particular, had become a source of genuine pleasure. The group was diverse in age and background, and our discussions were lively and respectful. When I shared my thoughts on the novels we read, people listened thoughtfully and responded to my ideas rather than dismissing them or changing the subject. It was a stark contrast to family dinners, where my attempts at conversation were often met with polite disinterest or subtle redirection to topics Rebecca deemed more appropriate or important. One evening at book club, a woman named Joyce mentioned that her daughter lived across the country and only called when she needed something. "I used to bend over backward trying to maintain that relationship," she said, "but I finally realized that I was doing all the work while getting very little in return. It was hard to accept, but some relationships are just unequal, and you have to decide whether you're willing to accept that or not." Her words resonated deeply with me. I'd been doing all the emotional labor in my relationship with Rebecca for years, adjusting my expectations, accommodating her preferences, accepting whatever level of involvement she was willing to offer. I'd been so focused on maintaining the connection that I'd lost sight of whether the connection was actually nourishing or just familiar. Meanwhile, Rebecca's frustration with my continued absence from family dinners was becoming more obvious. Her calls had become more interrogative, and she'd started mentioning how the children were asking about me. "Sophie wanted to know why Grandma doesn't come for dinner anymore," she'd said during our most recent conversation, clearly trying to use guilt as a motivational tool. I didn't know what to tell her. I'd responded calmly that she could simply explain that Grandma was busy with other activities, and that if Sophie wanted to see me, they could arrange a specific visit. This suggestion had been met with silence, as if the idea of making special arrangements to include me was unreasonable, even though that's exactly what I'd been doing for years, arranging my entire weekend around their schedule and preferences. The fourth Sunday, Rebecca called me directly instead of just assuming I wouldn't be there. "Mum, we really miss you at dinner," she said, her voice taking on what I recognized as her persuasive tone, the one she used in her marketing job. "The kids keep asking when you're coming back. Can't you join us this week?" There was something about the phrase "coming back" that struck me as revealing. It implied that I had temporarily strayed from where I belonged, rather than making a conscious choice about how to spend my time. It suggested that the natural order was for me to be available for their convenience, and that my absence was an aberration that needed to be corrected. "I appreciate that you miss me," I said, "but I'm committed to other activities on Sundays now." This was largely true. I'd been making plans for my Sunday afternoons that I genuinely enjoyed and didn't want to abandon. But more importantly, I'd realized that returning to those dinners would mean returning to a dynamic that had been slowly eroding my self-respect. What activities? Rebecca pressed. Can't you reschedule them? Family should come first. The irony of this statement wasn't lost on me. For years, I'd been putting family first, rearranging my schedule around Rebecca's preferences, accepting whatever terms she set for our relationship. But when she said, family should come first, she clearly meant that I should prioritize their convenience over my own needs and interests. These activities are important to me, I said firmly, just like your weekend plans are important to you. I was thinking specifically of all the times she'd been unavailable because of the Hendersons' barbecue or similar social commitments that took precedence over including me. If her social life was worthy of protection, surely mine was too. The conversation ended with Rebecca sounding frustrated and confused, as if she couldn't understand why I wasn't jumping at the chance to resume our previous arrangement. From her perspective, she'd been doing me a favor by including me in family dinners, and my continued absence probably seemed ungrateful and unreasonable. But from my perspective, I was finally treating myself with the same consideration I'd been giving to everyone else's needs and preferences. That night, I reflected on how much my sense of self-worth had improved over the past month. The constant low-level anxiety that had accompanied my interactions with Rebecca was gone. I wasn't spending mental energy trying to figure out how to be more appealing, less burdensome, more convenient. Instead, I was investing that energy in activities and relationships that were mutually rewarding. For the first time in years, I felt like I was living my life rather than just trying to fit into the margins of someone else's. The turning point came during the 5th week, when Rebecca showed up at my house unannounced on a Sunday afternoon. I was in my garden, repotting some plants I'd bought at the nursery that morning, when I heard her car in the driveway. Through the window, I could see her walking up to the front door with determined steps, her posture radiating the kind of focused energy she brought to business meetings or difficult conversations with the children. When I answered the door, still wearing my gardening gloves and apron, Rebecca looked me up and down as if she was seeing me for the first time in months. "Mum, we need to talk," she said without preamble. "This has gone on long enough." Her tone was brisk and authoritative, the one she used when she'd decided that a situation required her intervention and management. I invited her in, offered her coffee, and settled into my favorite chair in the living room. Rebecca remained standing, pacing slightly, clearly agitated by my calm demeanor. "I don't understand what's happening with you," she began. "You're acting completely different, and frankly, it's concerning. Dad hasn't even been gone that long, and you're already—" She trailed off, but the implication was clear. She thought my behavior was related to grief or some kind of mental decline. "I'm acting different, how?" I asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. From my point of view, I was simply making choices about my time and energy rather than automatically deferring to her preferences. But clearly, Rebecca saw my assertiveness as problematic or abnormal. "You're being stubborn and unreasonable," she said, finally sitting down on the edge of the sofa. "We've been having family dinners for years, and suddenly you decide you're too good for them. The kids don't understand why their grandmother doesn't want to see them anymore." Again, she was framing my absence in terms of not wanting to see them, rather than not wanting to participate in a dynamic that had become demeaning. "Have you considered," I said carefully, "that maybe the way these dinners have been structured hasn't been working well for me?" This was the most direct I'd been about my feelings, and Rebecca's reaction was immediate and defensive. "What do you mean, not working well?" "We include you every single week. We accommodate your dietary restrictions. We make conversation. What more do you want?" Her voice was rising, and I could see the genuine bewilderment in her eyes. From her perspective, she'd been performing the duties of a good daughter, and my dissatisfaction seemed ungrateful and unreasonable. This was the moment I'd been both dreading and anticipating. For weeks, I'd been acting on my feelings without directly confronting the issues that had led to my decision. But now, faced with Rebecca's defensive confusion, I realized that I owed both of us a clearer explanation. "Rebecca," I said, choosing my words carefully, "do you remember what you said to me the last time I came to dinner? When I asked about joining you at the Hendersons' barbecue?" I watched her face, looking for recognition, but her expression remained blank. The words that had been so devastating to me had apparently been forgettable for her. "I don't remember exactly," she said impatiently, "but I probably told you it wasn't appropriate. It was a couples event." Her dismissive tone suggested that she couldn't understand why this would have been hurtful, or why I would even remember such a minor interaction. "You told me that I should be grateful you invite me at all," I said quietly. "You said I should be grateful for the invitations to family dinner." The words hung in the air between us, and I watched as Rebecca's face went through several expressions: surprise, possible recognition, and then defensiveness. "I didn't mean it the way you're taking it," she said quickly. "I was just... You were being pushy about the barbecue, and I was trying to explain that we already include you plenty, more than most families do with..." She stopped herself, but I knew how that sentence would have ended. "More than most families do with elderly parents. More than most families do with widows. More than most families do with people who have become social obligations rather than welcome family members. The thing is, Rebecca," I said, "I realized you were right. I should be grateful for invitations, but only if they're genuine invitations from people who actually want me there. And for quite a while now, it's felt like you've been performing a duty rather than sharing your life with me." My voice remained steady, but inside, I was trembling with the vulnerability of speaking this truth aloud. Rebecca's face flushed, and I could see her struggling between anger and guilt. "That's not fair," she said. "I invite you every week. I cook dinner. I include you in the kids' activities. How is that not wanting you there?" But even as she spoke, I could see recognition dawning in her eyes. She was beginning to understand that inclusion and welcome weren't the same thing. "When was the last time you asked for my advice about something important?" I asked. "When did you last seem genuinely interested in my opinions or experiences? When did you last treat me like someone whose thoughts and feelings mattered, rather than someone you needed to manage and accommodate?" These weren't rhetorical questions, and the silence that followed them was telling. Rebecca opened her mouth several times as if to respond, then closed it again. I could see her mentally reviewing our recent interactions, perhaps recognizing for the first time how perfunctory and one-sided they'd become. The woman who had once called me for hours-long conversations about her job, her marriage, her parenting challenges, had gradually reduced our relationship to brief logistics calls and carefully time-limited visits. "I didn't realize," she said finally, her voice smaller than it had been when she'd arrived. "I didn't mean to make you feel unwelcome. I just... Things have been so busy, and I thought you understood that we're dealing with a lot right now." It was the beginning of an acknowledgement, but it was also an excuse. Everyone was busy. Everyone had pressures and challenges. But those circumstances didn't have to preclude treating family members with basic respect and consideration. The conversation continued for another hour, and it was unlike any discussion Rebecca and I had shared in years. For the first time, she seemed to be really listening to what I was saying, rather than just waiting for her turn to respond or deflect. I explained how her increasing impatience with my presence had made me feel like a burden rather than a beloved family member. I described the contrast between how she treated Karen's visits and how she treated my regular presence in their lives. But that's different, Rebecca protested when I brought up the Karen comparison. She lives far away and only visits twice a year. Of course, those visits are special events. It was the same justification she'd used before, but now I pushed back on it. Why does geography make her more worthy of celebration than I am? I asked. Why does scarcity make her visits more valuable than my regular presence in your lives? If anything, shouldn't the grandmother who's consistently available deserve as much consideration as the one who shows up occasionally? Rebecca didn't have a ready answer for this, and I could see her struggling with the logic of her own position. The truth was, she'd been taking my availability for granted while treating Karen's limited visits as precious commodities. My consistent presence had become invisible to her, like electricity or running water, essential but unnoticed until it was gone. I also told her about the activities I'd been pursuing instead of coming to Sunday dinners. When I described the book club discussions and the art history lectures, the watercolor class and the volunteer work at the library, Rebecca looked genuinely surprised. "I didn't know you were interested in any of those things," she said, and I realized that she'd stopped seeing me as a person with evolving interests and capabilities. In her mind, I'd become frozen at the moment Harold died, a grief-stricken widow whose only remaining purpose was to be grateful for whatever family contact she could get. "There are a lot of things you don't know about me anymore," I said gently, "because you've stopped asking. Our conversations have become about logistics and obligations, not about who we are or what we're thinking about." This seemed to genuinely shock her, as if the possibility that I had internal experiences worth exploring had never occurred to her. "But you never talk about those kinds of things," she said defensively. "You always just ask about the kids and James's work and what we've been doing." She was right, but she was missing the larger picture. I'd learned to stick to safe topics because my attempts to share my own thoughts and experiences had been consistently met with disinterest or subtle dismissal. "Do you remember the last time you asked me what I was reading?" I challenged her. "Or what I thought about something in the news? Or whether I had any interesting experiences that week?" Again, the silence that followed was telling. Rebecca's questions to me had become entirely functional, about my health, my house maintenance, my basic needs, as if I was a dependent whose care she was monitoring rather than a person whose inner life might be worth exploring. As our conversation progressed, I could see Rebecca beginning to understand how profoundly our relationship had changed. But understanding the problem and being willing to address it were different things. "So what do you want from me?" she asked, and there was a note of frustration in her voice that suggested she saw this as unreasonable demands rather than a request for basic consideration. "I want to be treated like a person you actually enjoy spending time with," I said simply. "I want conversations where you seem interested in my thoughts and opinions. I want to feel like my presence adds something to your life rather than just being something you have to manage." These seemed like basic expectations for any relationship, but from Rebecca's expression, they might as well have been impossible demands. "I do enjoy spending time with you," she said, but without conviction. I don't always know what to talk to you about. We're in such different stages of life now." This was closer to honesty than she'd been all afternoon, and I appreciated it, even though it was painful to hear. "Different stages of life don't have to mean we can't relate to each other," I said. "I've been through many of the experiences you're dealing with now. I raised children, managed a household, navigated marriage challenges, dealt with career pressures. I might actually have perspectives that could be helpful if you were interested in hearing them." The conversation ended without clear resolution, but something had shifted between us. Rebecca left, looking thoughtful rather than just frustrated, and I felt like I'd been honest about my experience without being cruel or manipulative. Whether this would lead to actual changes in our relationship remained to be seen, but at least we'd moved beyond the pretense that everything was fine. Over the following days, I found myself thinking about what kind of relationship with Rebecca would actually work for me going forward. I'd realized that I couldn't return to the previous dynamic, where I accepted whatever terms she offered. But I also wasn't sure what a healthier version of our relationship would look like. Did she have the capacity or willingness to see me as a full person again? Could she move beyond seeing me as an obligation to be managed? Time would tell, but I was no longer willing to accept less than I deserved, simply to maintain the illusion of family closeness. 3 weeks passed with minimal contact between Rebecca and me. She called once to check on a plumbing issue I'd mentioned months ago, and I updated her briefly on the repair. The conversation was polite, but stilted, as if we were both trying to figure out how to interact now that the old patterns had been disrupted. I could sense her waiting for me to bring up Sunday dinners or suggest alternative arrangements, but I didn't. The ball was in her court now, and I was curious to see what she would do with it. During this period, my new routine had solidified into something genuinely fulfilling. Sunday afternoons were now dedicated to what I'd come to think of as my time, sometimes spent at art galleries or museums, sometimes hiking local trails, sometimes simply reading in my garden or having long phone conversations with old friends I'd reconnected with. The anxiety and disappointment that had become associated with weekends was completely gone, replaced by a sense of anticipation for whatever I might discover or experience. The book club had become particularly meaningful to me. Our discussions were intellectually stimulating, and several members had become genuine friends. Joyce, the woman who'd shared her own story about setting boundaries with her daughter, had become a regular coffee companion. Through her, I'd met other women who were navigating similar challenges with adult children who seemed to view them as burdens rather than resources. One afternoon, while I was volunteering at the library, I saw Brandon, my 10-year-old grandson, come in with a school group. He spotted me immediately and ran over with genuine excitement. "Grandma, what are you doing here?" His enthusiasm was unguarded and delightful, so different from the careful politeness that had characterized our recent interactions during family dinners. I explained that I was helping with the literacy program, and his eyes lit up with interest. "You help people learn to read? That's so cool." He peppered me with questions about what I did, how I helped people, whether it was hard to teach adults to read. For 20 minutes, we had the kind of natural, flowing conversation that had become rare during our supervised family interactions. When his teacher called the group back together, Brandon hugged me tightly and said, "I'm going to tell Mom I saw you here. She'll be so surprised." His innocent pleasure in our encounter reminded me of what I'd been missing: genuine connection with my grandchildren, unfiltered by Rebecca's management and time constraints. That evening, Rebecca called. "Brandon said he saw you at the library today," she began, and I could hear curiosity in her voice. "He was very excited about your volunteer work." There was something different in her tone, less defensive than our recent conversations had been. "I've been working with the adult literacy program for several weeks now," I told her. "It's been incredibly rewarding." I found myself describing some of the students I'd been working with. Maria, who was learning to read so she could help her children with homework, and Robert, a veteran who'd struggled with dyslexia his whole life, but was finally getting the support he needed. That's really wonderful, Mum," Rebecca said, and she sounded like she meant it. "I had no idea you were doing something like that." For the first time in months, she seemed genuinely interested in something I was doing, asking questions about how the program worked and what my experience had been like. The conversation felt different from our recent exchanges, more like the talks we used to have when she was younger and still saw me as someone with experiences worth hearing about. When she asked if I was free for lunch later that week, just the two of us, I found myself saying yes. We met at a small cafe downtown, neutral territory that felt less loaded than either of our homes. Rebecca arrived looking nervous, fidgeting with her purse and ordering her coffee with unusual indecision. "I've been thinking a lot about our conversation," she began, once we'd settled at a corner table. "About what you said about feeling like a burden." "And?" I prompted, when she seemed to struggle with how to continue. "I think you were right," she said quietly. "I have been treating you like an obligation instead of like someone I want to spend time with. I didn't realize I was doing it, but looking back—" She paused, stirring her coffee unnecessarily. "I think I got so focused on being a good daughter in terms of making sure you weren't alone that I forgot about actually enjoying your company." This acknowledgement meant more to me than she probably realized. It wasn't a complete solution, but it was recognition of the problem, which was more than I'd expected. "What changed your mind?" I asked. "Partly it was talking to James," she admitted. "When I told him about our conversation, he said something that surprised me. He said he'd noticed that I seemed stressed and resentful around our Sunday dinners, and he'd wondered if maybe the arrangement wasn't working for anyone anymore." She looked up at me with something approaching vulnerability. "He also said he thought you seemed sad a lot lately, but that you perked up when you talked about your new activities." It was interesting to learn that James had been observing our family dynamics and had his own perspective on what was happening. I'd always gotten along well with him, but he'd seemed increasingly distant during recent family gatherings. Perhaps he'd been uncomfortable with the tension he was witnessing, but hadn't known how to address it. "I also realized," Rebecca continued, "that I've been talking to you the way I talk to the kids when they're being difficult. Like you're someone I need to manage, rather than someone I want to have a relationship with." This self-awareness was encouraging, though I wondered whether recognizing the pattern would be enough to change it. "The thing is," I said carefully, "I don't want to go back to the way things were. The Sunday dinners, the feeling like I was being tolerated rather than welcomed. I can't do that anymore." I needed her to understand that this wasn't just about hurt feelings that could be smoothed over with an apology. "I know," she said. "And honestly, I don't think I want to go back to that either. I didn't realize how much work it was to pretend everything was fine when it really wasn't." This was perhaps the most honest thing she'd said to me in years, acknowledging that the previous arrangement had been a strain for her too. We spent the next hour talking more openly than we had in years. Rebecca told me about pressures at work that had been affecting her mood at home, about feeling overwhelmed by the constant demands of parenting and marriage and career. I shared some of my own experiences from when she was young, times when I'd felt similarly stretched thin but hadn't known how to ask for help or space. "I think," Rebecca said as we prepared to leave, "maybe we need to figure out a different way to be family. Something that works better for both of us." It wasn't a complete solution, but it was the beginning of a conversation about rebuilding our relationship on more honest terms. Over the following months, we experimented with different ways of staying connected. Instead of obligatory weekly dinners, we began meeting for lunch every other week, just the two of us. These conversations were deeper and more meaningful than our family dinner small talk had ever been. Rebecca started asking about my volunteer work and book club, and I found myself sharing thoughts and experiences I hadn't talked about in years. We also began including the children in activities that were genuinely enjoyable rather than dutiful. I started taking Brandon to the library when he needed to research school projects, and Sophie and I began monthly adventure afternoons, where we explored new places around the city. These interactions felt natural and unforced, based on genuine mutual interest rather than obligation. The Sunday dinners evolved too. Instead of Rebecca cooking elaborate meals while I sat feeling like a guest in her home, we began alternating hosting duties. When I cooked, I prepared foods I enjoyed making, and Rebecca contributed dessert or sides she actually wanted to bring. When she hosted, the atmosphere was more relaxed, without the underlying tension that had characterized our previous gatherings. Most importantly, I'd learned to value my own time and energy. The activities I'd discovered during my absence from family dinners remained important parts of my life. I no longer rearranged my schedule automatically to accommodate Rebecca's preferences, and she no longer expected me to. We both had to make effort to coordinate our availability, which made our time together feel more intentional and valued. Looking back now, I realize that Rebecca's cruel comment about being grateful had actually been a gift, though not one she intended to give. It had forced me to examine what I was accepting and why I was accepting it. It had pushed me to rediscover my own worth and to insist on relationships that honored that worth. I'm not grateful for invitations anymore, not in the way Rebecca meant when she made that comment. Instead, I'm selective about which invitations I accept, choosing to spend my time with people who genuinely want my company and value my contributions. Rebecca has become one of those people again, but only because I was willing to risk losing her entirely rather than continue accepting less than I deserved. The woman who once felt diminished and apologetic about her presence in her own family's life had been replaced by someone who understood her own value. It had taken courage to step away from a familiar but harmful pattern, but the result was a life filled with genuine connections and activities that brought real satisfaction. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for a relationship is to refuse to participate in it until it becomes worthy of both people involved.